She sat down across from me at my table in the wrong restaurant, and I didn't say a word. And I want to be honest about why, because the honest reason is stranger and more embarrassing than any excuse I could construct in its place. I was sitting at a table for two in a mid-range Italian restaurant on a Saturday night, waiting for a first date who was already 14 minutes late. And the restaurant smelled of garlic and bread and warm candle wax. And the background noise was the specific comfortable murmur of a room full of people who had been brought somewhere pleasant and were finding it so. And I had been sitting with a glass of wine I'd ordered to avoid looking like I was waiting for someone while obviously waiting for someone. And the evening was in that specific suspended state of something that hasn't quite started yet. Then she walked in. She came in from the November cold with her coat still on and her hair slightly undone. From the wind and the specific focused expression of someone who has found the place they were looking for and is relieved about it. And she sat down across from me with a settled confidence I found immediately arresting. And she looked at the menu, and I looked at her, and I said nothing. Not nothing because I didn't know what to say. Nothing because I made in the space of approximately 3 seconds the worst possible decision available to me. I decided to wait and see what happened. She was there for almost 2 minutes before she looked up from the menu and saw me, not the blurred background presence she'd been registering, as she settled in, and her face did something immediate and involuntary that I have spent the time since trying to describe accurately and haven't managed. It was not quite embarrassment. It was not quite amusement. It was the specific, unguarded expression of a person who has just understood that the situation they are in is considerably stranger than they thought 30 seconds ago and who is recalculating everything in real time. She looked at the menu. She looked at me. She said, "You're not James." And I said, "No." And she said, "I'm in the wrong restaurant." And I said, "I think so." And she looked at me for another moment and said, "Do you mind if I stay for a minute? My feet hurt, and I've been in heels since 4 o'clock. I told her I didn't mind at all, which was true, and which was the beginning of the only good decision I made that entire evening. Let me take you back to the weeks before this happened, because the restaurant doesn't make sense without understanding exactly how I had arrived at that particular Saturday night, alone at a table for two, in the specific emotional state of a person who had prepared carefully for an evening and was not sure he wanted it. My name is Noah. I'm 31. I work as a civil engineer for the city, and I had been, at the time of this story, on approximately 9 first dates in the preceding 8 months, which is not a large number by the standards of people who approach dating efficiently, but which represents for me a significant investment of a particular kind of hope that I find increasingly difficult to sustain and which depletes itself a little more with each date that goes the way most of them had gone, pleasantly, forgettably, without the specific quality of something that was going to matter. I had been single for 2 years, following a 4-year relationship that ended because the person I'd been with had decided, with complete honesty and no particular cruelty, that she wanted a life that looked different from the one we were building together. And I respected this and understood it and found it, in the months after, genuinely difficult to be inside. I was not devastated in a way that had stopped me from functioning. I was instead in the longer, quieter aftermath of something significant. The specific state of a person rebuilding a life around an absence and doing it correctly, mostly, but slowly. I should describe what those 9 dates had actually been like, because I think it matters for understanding the specific emotional state I was in by the time the wrong woman sat across from me. They had all been with people who were, by any reasonable measure, good, interesting, employed, pleasant to be around, carrying the specific energy of someone who was also attempting this with good faith and some hope. And all of them had produced the same specific outcome. An evening that I could describe accurately and completely to anyone who asked, but which left no residue. No specific preoccupation, nothing that was still there the next morning demanding attention. I had come to understand this as my primary indicator of whether something was going to matter, whether it was still there the next morning. Nothing, in 8 months, had been still there the next morning. I was starting to wonder if this was something about the dates or something about me, and the wondering was not comfortable. The date that Saturday was named Claire, She was a friend of a colleague's wife, the recommendation arriving with the specific warm enthusiasm of people who think they are doing you a favor and are not entirely wrong. I'd looked at her profile, exchanged several messages that were warm and intelligent, and agreed to dinner at a restaurant I liked and could walk to, which is the configuration I've found works best for first dates, a known quantity in the physical space, leaving cognitive space available for the actual human encounter. I had gone in, as I generally went into these evenings, with a genuine attempt at optimism, and a quiet awareness that optimism of this specific variety had a certain track record I had been unable to improve significantly. Regardless of how thoughtfully I approached the preparation, what I had not expected was the woman who was not Claire should describe what she looked like. Because it matters for the story and because the description is honest rather than strategic. She was maybe 29. With dark hair, the wind had done something interesting on the way in, and an open, considered face. The face of someone who looked at things carefully before deciding how to feel about them. She had a quality of self-possession that was immediately apparent and immediately attractive. Not confidence in the performed sense, but the quieter, more fundamental thing underneath it, the ease of a person who was comfortable being exactly who she was. She had dark eyes that caught light in a specific way when she looked around the room, and she looked around the room the way people look when they are genuinely curious rather than monitoring for exits, which is a distinction I have learned to notice. She sat down and crossed her arms slightly on the table in front of her in a posture that was not defensive but simply at rest, the posture of someone whose body knows where it belongs. I noticed all of this in approximately 90 seconds, during which I said nothing. And then she looked up and saw me, and the situation reorganized itself entirely. Her name was Jade. She'd been trying to reach a restaurant called Palazzo Rosso on the next block, which my restaurant resembled closely enough from the outside in November darkness that the mistake was entirely defensible. She worked in urban planning, which she mentioned when I asked what she'd been doing all day that involved 4 hours of heels. And she described her work with the specific combination of passion and dry-humored exasperation that told me she cared about it deeply and found it frequently absurd, which is probably the accurate description of most meaningful work. She was there because a colleague was getting married and there was a dinner, and she had come from the venue walkthrough directly to the restaurant, or to the restaurant she had thought she was going to, and she had come alone because she had been too busy that week to arrange someone to bring. She stayed for 12 minutes. I counted afterward because the 12 minutes produced more actual conversation than most of the dates I'd been on in the preceding 8 months, and I found myself wanting to account for the time properly. She said something sharp and funny about a project she'd worked on where the engineering constraints had been described to the planning team in a way that sounded like a limitation and were actually a misunderstanding. And the thing she said was so precise about the nature of that particular kind of miscommunication that I stopped tracking time and started tracking what she was saying instead, which is not a thing that had happened to me often enough in the preceding 8 months. Then her phone buzzed, and she looked at it and looked at me with the composed apology of someone who is actually sorry about having to leave rather than performing. The apology as a social formality. "That's James," she said. "He's at the right restaurant and wondering where I am." She stood, straightening her coat with a small efficiency of movement I noticed without meaning to. She looked at me for a moment in a way that was neither invitation nor finality, but something between the two. The look of someone who has recognized that a moment has had something in it and is choosing not to announce that recognition directly. "I hope your date shows up," she said. "It was genuinely nice to meet the wrong person tonight." Then she left, and the restaurant settled back into its ordinary Saturday noise. And I sat there for a moment turning over what she'd said. And then Claire arrived, and the evening continued as scheduled. And I thought about Jade 3 more times during dinner before I consciously acknowledged that I was thinking about her. Claire was lovely. The dinner was pleasant. She was the 9th person I'd met this way, and she had the same quality all 8 before her had had. Genuine warmth, reasonable intelligence, no obvious flaws, no specific chemistry. We talked for 2 hours about things I could reconstruct accurately if asked, and which did not, while I was talking about them, produce the specific internal quality of two people discovering each other. She was trying. I was trying. The trying was visible in both of us in the specific way of people who are doing the correct things and finding them insufficient. I drove home afterward with the feeling of a person who had done a thing correctly and found it less satisfying than they'd hoped. And I sat in my kitchen with a glass of water and thought about the 12 minutes and the things she'd said about meeting the wrong person. And I understood that the 12 minutes had produced something I would not be able to simply decline to examine. The 12 minutes, unlike the preceding 8 months, had left a residue. The 12 minutes were still there. I went back to the restaurant the following Saturday. I want to be clear about what this was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a strategy. It was the thing you do when something has lodged itself in the part of your mind that runs underneath the deliberate part, and you don't have any better options. I sat at the same table. I ordered the same glass of wine I'd had the first night. The restaurant was busy in the specific way of a Saturday dinner service, and I recognized no one in it, and no one came who I was looking for. I stayed for an hour, which is approximately the amount of time a person can sit alone at a restaurant table without a dinner reservation before the social awkwardness becomes significant. And then I drove home. I told Marcus about it the next day, because Marcus was the kind of friend who could be told things like this without converting them into an opportunity for sustained ribbing at a later date, or at least not too sustained. He said with the specific dry precision of a person who has known me long enough to have calibrated his responses to my actual, rather than my reported level of self-awareness. "You're going back next week, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. I said I was probably going to do it one more time, yes. He said that was either romantic or a warning sign, and it would depend on the outcome which one it turned out to be. I said I understood that. I drove home from that conversation telling myself I was not going to do it again. And then I thought about urban planning and misunderstood engineering constraints, and the way she'd said it was genuinely nice to meet the wrong person, and I knew I was going to do it again. She was there on the third Saturday. I almost missed her. I was looking at my phone when she walked in, and she was across the room and seated before I looked up. And it took me a moment to be certain because she was wearing something different, and her hair was up. And then she turned toward the room the way she had the first time. The genuinely curious look, and I was certain. She was with someone this time, a woman who was clearly a friend rather than a date from the specific relaxed ease of how they sat. I thought about leaving. I thought about staying invisible. I ordered another glass of wine and stayed. She saw me 20 minutes later. The recognition crossed her face in a way that was specific and private, a small thing that came and went before her expression settled back into its ordinary composure. She excused herself from her table. She walked across the restaurant. She stood at the edge of my table and looked at me with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. The primary one of which was, "I'm deciding how to feel about this." She said, "You're here again. Not a question." I said, "I am." She looked at me for another moment and said, "Did your date from last time come?" And I said Claire had arrived and we'd had dinner and it had been nice. And she said, "But you're back." And I said, "But I'm back." And she looked at me for a moment longer with that specific expression that was deciding, and then she said, "Give me 10 minutes," and went back to her friend. I watched. Across the restaurant, as she said something to the friend that produced a quick, evaluating look in my direction from the friend, followed by a longer conversation between the two of them that I could not hear, and which concluded with the friend looking at me again with a different expression than the first time, the specific expression of a person who has been given additional context and is revising their initial assessment. Then Jade said something else, and the friend laughed and said something brief in return that looked from this distance like it might have been go. Jade came back in 8 minutes instead of 10. She sat down across from me. Again, and the specific symmetry of that was not lost on either of us. She said, "I told her I'd run into someone." I said, "What did you tell her about who?" She said, "I told her you were the man I'd sat with by accident in November and had thought about more than was probably warranted." She said it the way she said everything, directly, without constructing an apologetic scaffolding around it first. I appreciated this in a way I didn't immediately have language for. Most people I'd met in the preceding year had said the things they meant at an oblique angle, requiring interpretation, a kind of defensive indirection I'd become accustomed to, and which I hadn't consciously noticed as a pattern until someone simply didn't do it. I said, "What made you decide to come back over?" She looked at me for a moment with the expression that I would later understand was her assessment face, the one she used when she was taking the measure of something before responding to it. She said, "The Saturday thing, you came back 2 weeks in a row. I thought that deserved an acknowledgement." I said, "It might just mean I like the restaurant." She said, "If you just liked the restaurant, you'd have a reservation." She was right. I didn't have a reservation. I'd been sitting at a walk-in spot both Saturdays, and she had correctly identified that a person who merely liked a restaurant would have called ahead. I said, "Fair point." She said, "I thought so," and the evening began in earnest. We talked for 2 hours. Her friend left at some point, stopping by the table to meet me with the specific warm assessment of a person who has been brought into the confidence of a situation and is vetting the principal party, and I appear to have passed this assessment because she said something warmly to Jade as she left and looked at me with the approving expression of someone giving implicit permission to proceed. We stayed until the restaurant staff were doing the pointed cleaning that signals they would like you to consider leaving. We did not consider leaving until it was no longer possible to remain, and even then we stood on the sidewalk in the November cold for 20 minutes, not quite ready to end the conversation, and the specific quality of that unwillingness to let the evening close, on both of our parts held simultaneously, neither of us performing it, felt like the first genuinely mutual thing that had happened to me in a long time. I asked for her number before she got into a cab. She gave it to me without hesitation, which is the kind of speed that tells you the answer had been decided before the question was asked. I texted her the following morning with no particular pretext, just a reference to something she'd said about a planning project that I'd been thinking about since she'd mentioned it, and she replied within the hour, and the conversation we started that Sunday continued, with the necessary interruptions of work and sleep and the logistics of actual life, for the better part of the week. I asked for her number before she got into a cab. She gave it to me without hesitation, which is the kind of speed that tells you the answer had been decided before the question was asked. I stood on the sidewalk after the cab left and thought about the fact that I had, over the preceding 2 months, made a decision I would not have been able to predict making. The decision to go back to a restaurant twice without a plan, without an approach, without any mechanism for what would happen if she didn't appear or if she did. And that the decision had produced, against all sensible probability, exactly the outcome I would have designed if I'd been the kind of person who designed outcomes rather than the kind of person who stood at a sidewalk and hailed cabs and thought about urban planning on the walk home. I texted her the following morning with no particular pretext, just a reference to something she'd said about a planning project that I'd been thinking about since she'd mentioned it, the specific kind of miscommunication she'd described between the engineering team and the planners, and she replied within the hour with something that added an additional layer to what she'd said the night before, and the conversation we started that Sunday continued, with the necessary interruptions of work and sleep and the logistics of actual life for the better part of the week. I noticed, sending those messages, that I was doing something I hadn't done in a year, composing what I wanted to say before I said it, not out of anxiety about getting it right, but out of genuine care about the texture of the exchange. She responded in kind. Her messages had the same quality of attention she brought to everything, specific and considered rather than efficient and approximate. And by Wednesday, I understood that whatever was happening over text was not filling a gap until we could see each other again, but was its own thing, its own form of the conversation that had started on a Saturday in November in a restaurant neither of us had planned to be in together. We had dinner the following Thursday, a restaurant we'd both chosen specifically because neither of us had been to it before, a neutral ground that belonged to neither the wrong restaurant nor to anywhere with prior associations. I arrived first, and she arrived exactly on time, which I had not anticipated and which I found immediately consistent with the quality of self-possession that had struck me the first night. She arrived without the slightly undone quality of the first meeting, the wind, the hurry, and instead with the composed directness of someone who had prepared for something they'd decided to do rather than arrived at by accident. She sat down across from me at the table I'd chosen by the window, and the candlelight did something particular to the room that made the evening feel deliberately staged in a way I appreciated rather than found self-conscious. We sat across from each other, and the conversation moved from where we'd left it on Sunday with the specific ease of something that had found its natural velocity and was simply continuing. I learned things about her that evening that I had been curious about since the first night. The specific arc of how she'd come to urban planning from a background in architecture, the family she'd grown up in and what it had taught her about space and how people move through it, the relationship she'd come out of the previous year and what she understood about it now that she hadn't at the time. She told me all of this with the same direct matter-of-factness she brought to everything, and I told her comparable things about myself, and there was a quality to the exchange that I can only describe as the relief of a person who had been having conversations that required significant translation for a long time and was now having one that didn't. She said, toward the end of the dinner, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Of course," and she said, "What were you actually hoping would happen those Saturday nights? What were you expecting me to do with you sitting there?" I thought about the honest answer, which was different from the answer I'd been telling myself. I said, "I think I wanted to demonstrate something." She said, "What?" I said, "That I was the kind of person who showed up to the thing, even when I didn't have a better plan than that." She looked at me for a moment with the expression she got when she was taking something in properly rather than just hearing it. Then she said, "That's a better answer than I expected." I said, "I've been working on the gap between my actual answers and the answers I give." She smiled, the specific slow smile of someone who finds something more pleasing than they were prepared for, and we ordered dessert, and neither of us was in any hurry to end the evening. I walked her home that night because she lived close and because neither of us wanted the evening to simply stop at the restaurant door. We stood on her street for a long time talking about nothing in particular, which is the thing people do when the particular thing they might otherwise do requires more decision than the moment has arrived at yet. And at some point she looked at me with that expression. The one I had been watching all evening and that I had begun to understand was her actual face rather than a performance of it, the face of someone who is paying attention and has no particular need to conceal the paying attention. And she said, "I'm going to want to see you again." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't really a statement. It was the declaration of a person who had been looking at something and had decided what it was, and who was simply reporting the conclusion with the same directness she brought to everything. I said I was going to want that too, and I meant it with a completeness I hadn't accessed in 2 years. And she went inside, and I walked home through the November city, feeling something I recognized clearly enough to name it, and was careful enough not to name it yet, because it was too early to name it, and because the naming of things changes them. And I wanted to hold this one a little longer in the state it was in, which was the state of something very good that had not yet been subjected to the particular pressure of a word. We kept seeing each other. The dinners became more frequent. The conversations deepened in the specific way of two people who have discovered that the person across from them is genuinely interested in what they actually think rather than a presentable approximation of it, and who discover in this the specific relief of being known rather than estimated. She was, in close quarters, exactly who she had appeared to be in those 12 first minutes. Someone whose self-possession was not performance, but infrastructure. Someone who said what she meant. Someone who moved through the world with the specific quality of attention that made every room she entered feel slightly more considered than it had been before she arrived. I noticed things about her that I filed away without telling her I was filing them. The way she described problems she was working on, with the same animated clarity she brought to everything important. hands moving slightly when the thing she was describing occupied space rather than just time. The way she was with people she liked, the specific warmth that coexisted with the directness rather than being dampened by it. The way she laughed, which was not the laugh people perform to signal appreciation, but the genuine version that comes before the self-consciousness can arrive. The way she looked at things she found beautiful, a building, a stretch of winter light on a city block, with a stillness that was different from the active engagement she brought to everything else, the specific quiet of someone who understands that some things require simply being received. There was a specific evening in December, about 3 weeks into seeing each other properly, when we were walking through the city after dinner and we turned a corner onto a block she'd been meaning to show me. A stretch of 19th century buildings that had been retrofitted badly, she explained, in a way that was common in this city and that drove her professionally insane. And she described what the original facade had looked like from the evidence of the surviving details. And I stood on the sidewalk looking at something I'd walked past probably 50 times and suddenly saw it as an argument between what something had been and what it had been turned into. And I thought, this is what she does. She changes how you look at the world by showing you that the way you were looking at it was only one way. And it is not a small thing to find a person who does this. The conversation that mattered most happened on a Sunday morning in February, 5 months after the restaurant. We were in her apartment and she was making coffee and I was sitting at her kitchen table and she brought 2 cups over and sat across from me, which was by then a familiar geography, us across from each other, and she looked at me with the expression she used when she was about to say something true rather than strategic, and she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly rather than correctly." I said I would try. She said, "What do you think this is?" Meaning us. Meaning the 5 months. Meaning the thing neither of us had named yet despite it being obvious to both of us and to her friend and to my colleague who had noticed the change in me and mentioned it in the specific sideways way people mention things they approve of. I said, "I think it's the thing I was afraid wasn't going to happen again." She looked at me in the quiet, specific way she looked at things she was taking in properly. I said, "After the last relationship ended, I thought I understood what I needed, and I went through 8 months of trying to find it in various people who were all good and none of them were right. And then you sat down in the wrong restaurant and talked to me for 12 minutes and I could not stop thinking about it. And I went back twice to a restaurant hoping I would see you again, which is not something I would have predicted myself doing. And now it's February, and I understand that what I think this is the thing I didn't think I was going to find, and was going to have to figure out how to make peace with not finding." She was quiet after this for a moment that was not uncomfortable but full, the specific quality of silence in which something true has been said and the room is adjusting to it. Then she said, "I sat down in the wrong restaurant and stayed for 12 minutes because my feet hurt. But that's not why I thought about you afterward." I said, "Why did you?" She said, "Because you let me stay. You didn't correct it. You just said it was fine. And there was something in that, in you choosing the stranger over the correct response, that told me something specific about who you were." She paused, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, the specific habit she had when she was choosing words. "And then you came back twice," she said, "and that told me the rest." I told her I loved her that Sunday morning at her kitchen table over coffee, without a plan for when to say it, simply when the truth of it became more obvious than the effort of not saying it. I had been carrying it for a while. The way you carry something you're not sure is the right moment to set down, and that morning, with the gray February light coming through her kitchen windows and the coffee cooling between us and her, looking at me with the expression I had been watching for 5 months, the moment arrived and I said it. She said she loved me back, with the same direct matter-of-factness she brought to everything true, without any performance around it. We sat at her kitchen table for the rest of the morning doing nothing in particular. She read, I worked on a calculation I'd been putting off. We talked about things that had nothing to do with any of the preceding. the specific luxury of two people who have said the important thing and found it received, and who now have the specific luxury of ordinary life continuing. At some point she said, without looking up from what she was reading, "You know, James never did come find me that first night." I said I hadn't thought about that. She said she'd texted him eventually and explained she'd gotten confused and gone to the wrong restaurant and ended up talking to a stranger. He'd said that was very her. She said it without vanity, the simple acknowledgement of someone accurately known by the people in their life. I asked her what he'd meant. She said, "He meant I do this. I end up somewhere by accident and make myself at home and come out the other side having found something better than wherever I was trying to go." She said it with the slight, self-aware smile of someone describing a quality they've made their peace with. I said, "Was this one of those times?" She looked at me over whatever she'd been reading. "I think you know the answer to that," she said. I said I thought I probably did. I said I thought James was right about her. She said she thought so too, and went back to reading, and we sat in the February morning light in the comfortable, particular quiet of two people who have, between them, found exactly the thing they were looking for, in exactly the wrong place. I thought about the first restaurant, the wrong one, the 14 minutes of a first date who hadn't arrived yet, the 12 minutes of a stranger who had sat down in the wrong chair. I thought about how the whole thing traces back to a mistake, to a wrong address in November, to me staying quiet when the correct response was obvious. I thought about what she had said, that staying quiet had told her something specific about who I was. I thought she was right about that. I also thought that the version of this story where I say, "I think there's been some confusion," immediately, the responsible, correct version, ends right there, politely and conclusively, and that everything that came after those 12 first minutes requires the specific bad decision of saying nothing, of choosing the stranger over the correct response, of letting the wrong thing become, as it turned out, exactly the right one. The correct thing was never going to be as good as this.